I remember the night vividly. It was a stormy evening, the kind that made you want to curl up in bed with a good book and a cup of tea. But instead, I found myself babysitting two young children while their parents were out for the night. At first, everything seemed normal. The kids were well behaved and we spent the evening playing games and watching movies. But as the night wore on, strange things started to happen. I heard strange noises coming from upstairs, but when I went to investigate, I found nothing out of the ordinary. The children didn't seem to hear anything, so I assumed it was just my imagination. But then, things took a turn for the worse. The power went out, leaving us in complete darkness. The children began to cry, and I tried my best to comfort them. But then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I froze, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman, but her face was twisted in a grotesque expression. I screamed and grabbed the children, running for the front door. But it was locked from the outside, trapping us inside. I knew we had to find a way out, so I led the children through the darkened house, trying to find another way out. But the woman was always one step ahead of us, her twisted face appearing in every doorway we passed. Finally, we made it to the basement, and I found a window that was small enough for us to crawl through. We made our escape, running through the rain to the neighbor's house. It wasn't until we were safe inside that I realized the truth. The woman we had seen was not a stranger, but the children's mother. She had been playing a prank on us, and it had gone too far. I was shaken by the experience, but grateful that we had made it out unharmed. From that night on, I made sure to always trust my instincts and keep a close eye on the children I babysat. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the children's mother. Her twisted expression and deliberate footsteps still haunted me. I couldn't bring myself to babysit for them again, no matter how much they begged. But the children's mother had other plans. She began to show up at my doorstep, insisting that I continue to watch her children. I tried to politely decline, but she became more and more insistent. She even started leaving threatening notes and messages, warning me that if I didn't watch her children, something terrible would happen. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police without any evidence, and I didn't want to put the children in danger by refusing to watch them. So I reluctantly agreed to watch them one last time. As soon as I arrived at their house, I knew something was wrong. The lights were flickering, and there was a strange smell in the air. I tried to ignore it and focus on the children, but they seemed just as uneasy as I was. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard the same slow, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs, and my heart raced with fear. I grabbed the children and tried to lead them to safety, but the house was a maze of darkened corridors and locked doors. We were trapped, and the footsteps were getting closer. I could hear the children's mother laughing, and I knew that this was no prank. She had lured us into a trap, and now she was going to kill us. But just when all hope seemed lost, the police burst through the door. They had been tipped off by a concerned neighbor who had heard the children's mother talking about her plans. She was arrested, and we were all taken to safety. I never babysat again after that night. The memories of that terrifying experience still haunt me to this day, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived in time. In the aftermath of that harrowing experience, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. I was grateful to be alive, but the fear and trauma lingered on. The children's mother was sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder, and I was relieved to know that she would never be able to harm anyone again. But even with her behind bars, I still felt a constant sense of unease, always looking over my shoulder and second-guessing every sound and shadow. I tried to move on with my life, but the memories of that night continued to haunt me. I found myself avoiding babysitting gigs, unable to shake the fear that something like that could happen again. But fate had other plans for me. One day, a friend asked me to watch her children while she ran some errands. I hesitated, but ultimately agreed. After all, what could go wrong in broad daylight? As soon as I arrived at their house, I knew something was off. The air was thick with tension, and the children were unusually quiet. I tried to brush it off and distract them with some toys, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. And then I heard it. The slow, deliberate footsteps, just like the ones from that fateful night. I froze, paralyzed with fear. But this time, I wasn't alone. The children's mother burst into the room, brandishing a knife and screaming incoherently. I grabbed the children and ran for the door, but it was locked from the outside. We were trapped, with no way out. But then, something miraculous happened. The children began to sing, a beautiful, haunting melody that filled the room with light and hope. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped. The children's mother was gone, the knife lying on the ground. We were safe. I never did find out what happened that day. The children didn't seem to remember anything out of the ordinary, and the mother was never seen again. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never underestimate the power of music again. From that day on, I made sure to always have a playlist of calming music on hand, just in case. And while the memories of those 2 terrifying nights still haunt me, I take comfort in knowing that I was able to protect those children when they needed it the most. Despite the terror of those 2 experiences, I found myself drawn to the mystery of it all. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, something beyond just the actions of a deranged woman. So I began to do some research, digging into the history of the families I had babysat for. And what I discovered sent shivers down my spine. It turned out that both families had a history of mental illness, with several members who had suffered from delusions and hallucinations. And both families had a connection to a local cult that had been disbanded years ago. I delved deeper, trying to uncover any clues or connections that could explain what had happened. And then, one day, I stumbled upon a letter. It was from a member of the disbanded cult, addressed to the leader. In it, the writer detailed their plans to use mind-altering techniques to create a new generation of followers, ones who would be loyal and obedient to the cult's teachings. And then, in the final paragraph, the writer mentioned 2 families that they had targeted for their experiments. Families with a history of mental illness and vulnerable children. I felt sick to my stomach as the pieces began to fall into place. The children's mother had been a member of the cult, and she had been using her children as part of their twisted experiments. And when I had stumbled upon their plans, she had seen me as a threat. It was a chilling realization, one that made me fear for the safety of those vulnerable families. But armed with the knowledge of what had happened, I was determined to do something about it. I reached out to local authorities, sharing my findings and urging them to investigate the cult and their twisted experiments. And slowly but surely, the truth began to come to light. The cult members were arrested, and the families were given the help and support they needed to heal from the trauma of their experiences. And while the horror of those 2 nights would never truly leave me, I took comfort in knowing that I had been able to uncover the truth and help bring justice to those who had suffered. In the end, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. And sometimes, the most terrifying horrors can be overcome with the power of truth and justice. But even with the cult members behind bars and the families receiving the support they needed, I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The letter had mentioned only 2 families, but what about the others? I decided to keep digging, determined to uncover any other families who had been victimized by the cult's twisted experiments. And that's when I found it, a list of names hidden away in an old file cabinet in the cult's abandoned headquarters. The list was long, with dozens of names of families who had been targeted for the cult's mind-altering experiments. And as I read through the names, my heart sank. I recognized many of them from the families I had babysat for, and I knew that there were countless others out there who had suffered in silence. I knew I had to do something to help these families and bring the cult's dark secrets to light. But I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. So I reached out to a friend, a journalist who had experience investigating cults and their activities. Together, we began to piece together the puzzle, gathering evidence and interviewing survivors. And what we uncovered was even more shocking than we could have imagined. The cult had been operating for decades, using their mind-altering techniques to create a network of loyal followers and control over vulnerable communities. But we didn't stop there. With the help of the families we had uncovered, we launched a campaign to raise awareness about the cult's activities and demand justice for their victims. The response was overwhelming, with thousands of people coming forward to share their own stories of how the cult had affected their lives. And eventually, the cult's leaders were brought to justice, and the families received the support and help they needed to heal from their trauma. It was a long and difficult journey, one that left me exhausted and shaken to my core. But it was also a reminder that even in the face of the most terrifying horrors, there is always hope. And with the power of truth and justice on our side, we can overcome even the darkest of evils. As the dust settled and the families began to rebuild their lives, I found myself feeling both relieved and grateful for the outcome of our investigation. But despite the gravity of the situation, I couldn't help but feel a sense of humor about the whole thing. After all, who would have thought that my teenage job as a babysitter would lead me down such a twisted and terrifying path? I decided to write a book about my experiences, sharing the story of how I stumbled upon the cult's dark secrets and helped to bring them to justice. And as I worked on the manuscript, I couldn't help but chuckle at some of the absurd moments that had taken place. Like the time I had to chase a cult member through the woods in my pajamas, or the time I accidentally pepper sprayed myself in the face during a scuffle. And then there was the time I had to convince the police that I wasn't just some crazy teenager making up wild stories about a cult. That had been a fun conversation. In the end, my book became a bestseller, with readers flocking to the strange and wild story of a teenage babysitter turned cult investigator. And while I never could have predicted where my job would take me, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the journey and the laughs it brought along the way.